Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm Crosby Kemper, the director of the Kansas City Public Library, and we're glad that you're here for another Dateline Washington with David Von Drehle and tonight Justin Gillis. I'm going to mention a couple of upcoming programs to you. I hope are all getting our schedule, our monthly and weekly, our monthly calendar and our weekly blasts. If you're not, it is a blast to get our blasts. And I'll tell you why, with some great upcoming programs. Next week, we have a second return engagement of Terry Teachout, who is a wonderful writer. He's the theater critic for the Wall Street Journal, the cultural critic for commentary, also a columnist for the Journal on cultural affairs, and he's written a wonderful series of books, H.L. Mencken, a book on H.L. Mencken, a book that he came to talk about here at the library on Louis Armstrong, and now he's written a great book, I'm in the middle of it, on Duke Ellington, and he'll be here at the Central Library next Wednesday, the 20th. We also have, as you know, our ongoing series, Hail to the Chiefs. And we've had great crowds for all the presidents that we've talked about so far, even, believe it or not, John Tyler and Chester Alan Arthur and other highlights. But we're really going to test you on Thursday, November 21st. Philip Payne will be talking about Warren Harding. And Warren Harding, as you are probably aware, has achieved the bottom ranking of most presidential rankings. Now, I happen to disagree with that ranking, and I think Philip Payne will be interesting on this subject because he's really going to talk about his reputation. Anyway, that'll be at the Plaza Library, and of course we do that with our co-sponsor and partner, the Truman Library Institute. We have an ongoing series commemorating taking another look at the Kennedy assassination, and on appropriately Friday, November 22nd, we'll have a panel of our very distinguished, there are some really great historians, local historians, Ted Wilson, Jonathan Earl, Jenny Weber, and Jeffrey Moran, talking about the Kennedy assassination 50 years later. And last but not least, I want to mention, since I'm mentioning the ongoing series that we've got, we're beginning our 7th season, is it now, of Script in Hands with the Metropolitan Ensemble Theater. We're calling this year Exit Laughing, and we'll talk about the permanent exits and great laughter in Arsenic and Old Lace. Not talking about, they'll be presenting Arsenic and Old Lace on Sunday, November 24th. And I also want to mention that David will be continuing with this series in December with Robin Givon, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, and he can explain Robin and fashion maybe at the end of tonight's conversation. But tonight, I do get to introduce to you a man who needs no introduction after my, whatever it is, 10 introductions of him now so far, David Von Drehle. David, I thought maybe tonight I should, instead of doing my usual straight introduction, I should kid him a little bit. And talk about, he's been called the best dressed correspondent in the business, but the truth is Evan Thomas is the best dressed at Newsweek. It's not David at all. I've said before that his book on the Triangle Fire is the greatest book on an American disaster, but of course that's now no longer true now that Heilman and the other guy have written the book on the Romney campaign last year. But I decided I couldn't do that. I couldn't kid David. So I just want to be straight and say, as many of you probably know by now, David was the assistant managing editor at the Washington Post. He's won a number of journalism awards, worked for the Miami Herald, was the youngest sports writer in the history of the city of Denver, and has written some really wonderful books. The book on the Triangle Fire that I mentioned, he came here to the library for the first time to talk about his book on the second year of the Lincoln administration and the lead up essentially to the Emancipation Proclamation. He's a wonderful writer and a wonderful interviewer, as it turns out, in this series. And I also want to now introduce to you also, to bring them up on the stage, Justin Gillis, who's come to us from the New York Times. I do want to say, I think Justin is worried after I talked to him about food prices earlier that I might be a climate skeptic. I'm not. I'm just a New York Times skeptic. But Justin is the climate reporter for the New York Times. But for our purposes here in Kansas City, the most important thing about Justin Gillis is that his first visit to Kansas City was as an FFA farm boy from Georgia. And so he knows what he's talking about. I started to challenge him on his food price stories, and then he told me he was an FFA farm boy from Georgia, and I stopped. He's also won the Oaks Award for Distinguished Environmental Reporting. He runs the Green Blog and the Temperature Rising series for the New York Times. He was the genetics and biotech reporter for the Washington Post. He's been a Knight Science journalistic fellow. And he is, as those on the right say, the resident alarmist at the New York Times, as those on the left or maybe the center or the reasonable climate people say, a missionary for the truth. So ladies and gentlemen, David Von Drehle and Justin Gillis.
Thank you very much for coming out tonight for the fifth in our series of Dateline Washington. And once again, we've gone outside Washington to get perspective from New York, from one of my best friends going back to a long time ago, Justin Gillis. Justin is unique almost among journalists that I've met in 35 years in his appetite for difficult stories. As you heard earlier, he's taken on biotechnology, genetics. In his investigative days, he tried to successfully rooted out corruption in Dade County, Florida, which you'd think it would be very easy to root out corruption in Dade County because there's so much of it. But in fact, the fact that everyone is corrupt makes it very hard to get to the bottom of the corruption, and Justin did that very successfully before becoming an expert on medicine, on biogenetics, on the history of food, the Green Revolution of Norman Borlaug, on and on and on, the stories that he's managed to take from the vast, huge reams of information and fact and turn into riveting stories for the front page of the New York Times. I'm glad you're going to get a chance to meet him and see his brain at work. So let's start with this. Give us an overview of climate science right now.
You know, I really am just a kid from a trailer park in Georgia, you know, so this is, everybody has on their chairs, you know, David, you and I are sort of a convenient age. I'm 53. You're 52 now, is that right?
I am 52. I've always thought myself as much younger than you.
Yeah, much younger. On your chair is a document that, on the face of which are two pictures of the Arctic ice cap. And it so happens that you're looking at something that's occurred in mine and Dave's adult lifetime, essentially. I entered college in the fall of 1978. For you, I'm guessing, would have been fall of 79.
Correct.
The United States sent up, so we have information on sea ice in the Arctic going back many, many, many decades, but it's spotty and, you know, people weren't flying over it and stuff. In the fall of 1978, the United States sent up a satellite called the Nimbus 7 satellite, and for the first time we were able to shoot radar down and look at the sea ice and see what it was doing on a pretty much a daily basis, and we've been able to do that ever since. And so what you have in front of you are before and after pictures of the Arctic sea ice. as it has played out essentially over my adult lifetime and Dave's adult lifetime. It took a year to get that satellite shaken out, so our first real picture is from 1979, and then you see, I believe what we have there is 2012. You will see that in that time, the Arctic sea ice has been reduced by half, essentially, at the peak of the summer melt season, as a direct consequence of the warming of the Arctic, which is happening at a faster pace than for the planet as a whole. If our beloved Neil Armstrong, who died not that long ago, had been sitting in a lawn chair on the moon during those years, he would have seen this with his naked eye. That's how big a change this has been in the physiognomy of this planet. Everywhere you go, if you have eyes to see, the impacts are happening in front of us. Land ice is melting all over this planet. I've seen that myself in South America. I've seen that in Greenland. I've seen that in New Zealand. We are starting to see more heat waves. We are starting to see effects on rainfall. The list is long and daunting. And the real thing to know about this, folks, is this is just beginning. We're just in the early stages of the scale of change that's expected to happen on the planet over the coming decades. And I wish, David, honestly, you have 4 beautiful children. I have 6 nieces and nephews that I care about. I wish I could tell you that I've been looking at this for the last 5 years and come to the conclusion that we don't have anything to worry about and their futures are secure. I cannot sit here tonight and do that.
Well, that's why we moved to the middle of the country, to get far away from the edges, so that when the seas rise, we're going to be just fine here. So from that quick tour of the horizon, give us a sketch of the science. How much carbon is going into the atmosphere in a year now? Are there other greenhouse gases we need to be concerned about? Give us that sketch, and then we'll talk about what the projections look like.
Sure. The numbers really won't mean much to folks. We're putting about 10 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere every year. About half of it stays up there, so the Earth is doing us the favor of pulling half the carbon out of the air. Roughly a quarter of it goes into the ocean, roughly a quarter of it goes into forests and into the land. The forests are taking up more carbon through time. People were worried that this effect would taper off, but it hasn't. And so we've got these numbers down to a pretty precise, and there really is no, there's legitimate scientific debate about a lot of things. There really is no legitimate debate about, how much we're putting up and where it's coming from. The level, if this means anything to people, I'll throw some numbers out. We know from looking, we've drilled into the ice caps and recovered air bubbles going back almost 1 million years. So we know the exact composition of the atmosphere going back 1 million years. We can see a very, very close association through time between the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it has varied, and the temperature of the Earth. They move in lockstep, and it looks to be quite clear that carbon dioxide is the master control knob of the temperature of the planet. The level never got above, in the waxing and waning of the ice ages, it moved as low as 180 parts per million in the atmosphere up to a high of 280. So before the Industrial Revolution, it was at about 280. We have, in what amounts to a geologic instant, increased that by 41%. We just passed 400 parts per million. So the people in this room tonight are the first human beings, among the first human beings ever to breathe carbon dioxide with air with that much carbon dioxide in it. We are desperately trying in our politics and our approach to this to get ourselves into a position to stop at 550, but it seems highly unlikely that we'll be able to do that. And so the likelihood is we're going to triple or quadruple the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere before we're finally able to stop.
Triple or quadruple, so 1,000?
Maybe 1,000. We might get to 1,000.
And sketch out that world. What does it look like?
A world of 1,000 ppm is a pretty alarming prospect, really. We're probably talking over time, over some unknown period of time, about a substantial melting of the polar ice sheets. Not the one you see on the picture there. That is sea ice, and the melting of sea ice, it does lots of things, but it does not raise sea level. Melting of land ice does. Greenland appears to be fairly vulnerable to a warming of 2 or 3 degrees Fahrenheit, and it looks like we're going to go beyond that. West Antarctica appears to be vulnerable to a warming of maybe 3 or 4 degrees Fahrenheit. It looks like we're going to go beyond that. At the current CO2 level, we may be due for a 15 or 20 foot sea level rise over some unknown period of time. At 1,000 ppms, I think we'd be looking at 80, 100, 150 feet of sea level rise.
150 feet of sea level rise.
Right.
But you've said several times over some amount of time.
Yes.
Sketch out a little bit this issue of time frame, because one of the things that we may talk about in the questions, if not, I'll definitely talk to you about it, is the fact that much of what's been predicted for the next 10 years ago, hasn't yet happened. And so this question of when these effects are going to be seen is an issue for you in trying to explain what we can expect and what the problem is.
I would say it's the issue, really, timescale. And we all need to learn in thinking about this problem to approach this problem of timescale and to recognize that there are 2 timescales here. There's the human timescale in which we live our lives, and then there's the geologic timescale in which things happen in 10,000 and up year increments. When I first started learning about this, I thought, the sort of first thing you learn is it's not going to happen quickly. We're talking about effects that take hundreds, in some cases thousands, in some cases tens of thousands of years to play out. And I thought sort of, that's our friend, that it's going to happen so slowly. I mean, it means you and I get to live our lives, and I get to fly around the world and, burn all this jet fuel doing it, and we eat nice steaks and all that, and, and what's the problem? But of course, the time scale is the essence of the problem. What it means is it's crucial to understand that to the Earth system, as the scientists call it, to the climate system, what we're doing is happening essentially instantaneously on a geologic time scale. We're going from a certain amount of carbon to a hugely more amount of carbon in a geologic instant. The planet does not respond to that quickly. It's that ice takes a long time to melt, no matter how much you kind of dial up the thermostat. So it's going to take quite a bit of time for this to play out. The risk is that by the time we begin, you just know that eventually people will, and maybe this is starting already, people are beginning to see the effects, I think. There's beginning to be a political demand placed on our leaders to do something about it. I suspect that will intensify over time, certainly over the course of decades. And by the time that public demand, that democratic demand comes and elicits the appropriate response, it will be too late. There will be so much carbon in the air that we are then doomed, if you will, or fated to a very substantial change in the whole structure of the Earth and the way it works. And then the only question is, how long does all that take to play out? And this is our greatest risk, because we don't know. Our best hope, and there's still some hope, and particularly if we get emissions under control, I think there's considerable hope that it would play out slowly enough that even though the changes are huge, human society would have time to adjust over hundreds of years, thousands of years potentially. The risk is it comes upon us so fast that we can't adjust, and we get into a problem with the food supply, or we get into such a rapid sea level rise or something like that, that that human institutions can't cope with it, and we wind up in some variation of chaos, essentially.
What's the food supply problem? Give me that in a minute, because that sounds like a bigger issue to me than, I mean, some beaches go away or somebody has to move off an island. That I can picture. Food supply sounds dangerous.
We've had a glimpse already just in recent times of how dangerous that is. In 2008, if you'll recall, we had a run-up. We've had, let me back up and sketch the longer history. A lot of people have heard the term Green Revolution, and they know that in the sort of 60s and 70s, we had this, there were in the 60s, you know, fears of mass starvation and famine.
Right.
We had this spread around the world of the sort of high-yield technologies. They have environmental costs, by the way, but we can get a lot more yield with Norman Borlaug's techniques and so forth. And so for many decades, we had food supply outstripping the growth in the population, and as a consequence, food becoming cheaper. Whole countries grew up that became dependent on cheap food. There are countries in the Middle East that import 90% of what they eat, and you know, in a place where the population is heading toward 1 billion, if you can believe it. It's just a remarkable sort of feature of modern times. And so we have hit a wall on that. For a good 15 years now, growth in demand has been outstripping the growth in productivity. We've started to run dangerously low on our stocks. So we don't have the big reserves in food supply that we once had. In 2008, after a series of bad harvests, we had a tremendous run-up in food prices, doubling and tripling in some cases very rapidly. I don't know how much of this people remember, but we had food riots in 30 countries around the world. The government of Haiti fell. The government of Mexico was under tremendous strain. As we speak, I'm pretty convinced, and so are a lot of people, that high food prices are a factor in the Arab Spring and the revolts that we're seeing there. So this is a fragile system. We all, you know, I mean, I'm assuming for the foreseeable future you're going to be able to outbid some guy in Zimbabwe for your hamburger bun. I don't know where that leads him. But it's a fragile system. We have not secured the global food supply future in the present climate, much less the future climate. And now we have this fairly clear set of indications that the climate change, the rising heat stress on crops in important growing regions, not yet including the Midwestern United States, is becoming a drag on food production. It's probably only a few percent right now, and so it's not the biggest factor driving up prices. Our crazy biofuel policy may be a bigger factor at the moment driving up food prices. But a real question is arising about, are we going to be able to do this? You know, will we have the innovation and the adaptation that we need to meet what's going to be a substantially rising demand as we go from 7 billion to 10 billion, and as more of those people have the means and the income to eat food. So the scientists were pretty sanguine on this up until 5 years ago, and now that picture's changing.
I'm glad you say that picture's changing. Because I am just, as you pointed out, thanks for explaining to everyone how old I am at the start of the program. I am old enough to remember the food panics of the 1960s. I remember reading in my weekly reader that my future was going to be an ice age, that the next ice age was coming. And that seemed very frightening to me because I didn't like the cold at all. And yet here we so now I find myself in late middle age. There's been more than enough food for this population that was going to destroy the planet, according to Paul Ehrlich. And there's not going to be an ice age anymore. It's going to be a sauna. Talk to me about, why is this the story that we should panic the world about, given that we've lived through so many panics that we later are told oh, never mind?
I would certainly agree with you that, I think you could say that from 1945 to 2008, maybe, human life has tended to get better over time. But you're fooling yourself if you think civilization cannot go backward. We've seen that happen. Think about just think about in your minds the contrast and the difference between early imperial Rome, let's say, and what civilization was like then, and those beautiful saunas and bathhouses and things like that they had in those lovely Roman cities that many of us have toured, and what life was like for people 14 centuries later when the Black Death, wiped out, we now think, 25% of the population of the world at the end of a century of sort of famine and pestilence as the climate was changing, actually, as we were transitioning from a warm period to the Little Ice Age. I can't sit here tonight and tell you what the future holds. I really have no clue. What I can tell you is our smartest minds out there are trying to figure it out. They're racing, essentially, at this point, to keep up with developments on the ground. I mean, they see things happening in front of them that they don't understand and can't explain, and the science is in a full-out pant to understand, wait a minute, we thought Greenland was stable for 1,000 years, and now suddenly we see it sort of falling apart right in front of our eyes in the last 10 years. And so it's just very important for people to understand what the scientists are saying to us and what they're not. What they're saying is we are running a risk. That's the real message. We don't know, they say, exactly where on the risk continuum things will come down. In the best case, maybe there are going to be big changes, but they'll be slow enough that we can adapt to them and we can keep ahead of them. In the worst case, we see a real risk of things truly going to hell in a handbasket, and don't think it can't happen. And what they're saying to us is, all we can do as scientists is tell you what the risks are. The question then of what to do about it, and of essentially of how much money to spend to buy ourselves some insurance against the upper end possibilities, is a democratic question. That's not a scientific question. That's a question that people have to decide.
And we'll get to that in just a second, but let's talk a little bit about the controversy around this issue. It was supposed to be hotter by now than it is, right? We've seen less in the global average temperature. We've seen far less movement than some suggested we would have seen by now, 10 years ago, right? Fair to say. We've also seen significant reductions in emissions in the Western world that nobody projected 10 years ago. And yet I hear you saying situations more dire than when you and I discussed this same issue 15 years ago. You were educating me then, educate me now. Why is this, why doesn't the fact pattern add up more smoothly?
Mm-hmm. If people will look on the back of their little brochure, you'll see temperature history over the last, how far back does it go? Maybe it goes back to 1880, is that right? Something like that. And one thing you'll notice there is it's been a fairly, over time, a fairly continuous march upward, except that we had this long hiatus running through, essentially through the 1950s and the 1960s, in which temperatures just sort of flattened out. And people have literally been entertaining the question since 1898, what's it going to do to the Earth if we put all this carbon in the air? And that the question didn't really even become ripe scientifically until the 50s. And people looked at the temperature and said, well, you know what, it's not actually warming right now. But you see from that chart, that was just a hiatus. It was a 20-year sort of hiatus. And then, lo and behold, in the late 70s, it's funny, a fellow named Wally Broker, who's still alive, published a scientific article in 1978 in which he coined the term global warming, and the title was, "Are We on the Verge of a Pronounced Global Warming?" 1978. Pretty much starting exactly in 1978, a very pronounced and rapid global warming begins, and you can see it on that chart.
So Wally Brooker is to blame.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's, what is he, 80? Well, he's 80 something now. Lovely man. We're in a bit of a hiatus now. It's not actually as flat as the one in those 20 years. What has happened is the rate of warming has slowed down over the last, since about 1998. 1998 was an extremely hot year. It was an El Nino year. It was an extremely hot year. Since then, the rate of warming has slowed down, and we're in a bit of a plateau. But there is still, if you draw an honest line through the trend, there's still an upward trend. People think, first of all, we don't understand that mid-century hiatus. The leading theory is probably that all the pollution we were putting in the air then from smokestacks and stuff actually sort of brightened the earth and reflected sunlight away. And then when we started cleaning up our pollution in the traditional pollution sense in the 70s, the warming began. It may be it may be right now that the Chinese
they may be doing us a favor.
They may be doing us a favor for the time being, even though they're killing themselves with
their smog.
Right, with their smog. So the bottom line is these sort of short-term. Remember, we're trying to think here on geologic timescales. I mean, a 15-year warming pause is nothing in the sort of history of the Earth, and does the scientific community understand it? No, they don't really understand it. There are theories about what happened and why, but we don't have, from this century-long record we have now, there's sort of no reason to think it'll last, basically, and no reason in theory to think that we aren't more or less on target in our predictions. There's still, so people understand, we talk about the sort of climate skeptics and so forth. Within the mainstream science, this is a very robust science. People are arguing with each other all the time. There's a lot of contention and a lot of argument and a lot of sort of blood on the floor, essentially, over exactly how things are going to go, exactly how serious are they, and there's disagreement over the level of warming we'll get for any particular amount of carbon dioxide, for instance. You could get a range of views. But the idea that, if we keep pumping this stuff up at such a rapid rate, we get a substantial warming. Literally 97% of the people publishing in climate science subscribe to that at this point.
Talk a little bit about the challenge of covering this issue. You work for a newspaper that is seen by 35 or 40% of the country at least as coming from a political position from the left. They want to find a problem here. I'm being provocative. It's part of your big government agenda. And yet, at the same time, you need to be respectful at some level of questions about the science. You are not an opinion journalist. I've never seen you do that in your work, and yet you're occupying a very contentious piece of intellectual real estate. How do you navigate that?
My loyalty here really is to the truth, as best I can discern it. I'm a journalist, and I don't have a political agenda. I happen to think that if more people understood the truth about this situation, there would be a political reaction to that. It's remarkable to me. And in fact, I got into this because I was watching, like everybody else, for sort of 10 or 15 years. And I was frustrated at how bad a lot of the journalism was, for one thing, on it. And also just sort of amazed that, here's a reasonably credible scientific case that we have this huge problem, and the inability of the political system to react to that astonished me. And so I guess I had and still have this possibly naive idea that the key to democracy is public understanding, and if people understood this problem better, we could at least have a mature discussion about whether to do anything. We're in a situation where we haven't gotten to that discussion because for 30 years, the people who say, oh, the science is a hoax and so forth have managed to sort of occupy the stage or occupy enough of the stage that they've prevented the real democratic discussion from happening. If we ever get there to that discussion, I am in a camp. I mean, as you know, but many of the audience is not. I'm a bit of an economic conservative myself. I'm in the camp that thinks when we finally get to that discussion, the economic conservatives have a place at the table, and maybe a couple of places. It's not a crazy position to say, wait a minute, we got a lot of problems right now, in the world. Do we want to be spending money on something that's a problem 100 years from now? So I don't know. I mean, I'm living in a shooting gallery these days. That's my life. If you look on the internet, you'll see that I'm a communist left winger who's working toward one world government, and he wants to take away everybody's liberties, and I just go see the scientists and talk to them, and can I find any evidence of a massive global hoax going on? I can't really find that. How strong is the evidence that we got a problem? Boy, it's here. You ask that question, and they wheel it out in a wheelbarrow, stacked to the ceiling. I'm navigating my way as best I can, I guess.
Tell us a little bit about your background. You're not a scientist,
No,
right?
no, definitely not.
You went to journalism school?
I went to journalism school, followed science since I was a kid. I mean, you and I are of the age of, I remember sitting in my trailer in Georgia and watching the moon landing in 1968. My grandparents,
69.
69, yeah, my
That's
grandparents.
that kind of sloppiness that we journalists are known for, but go ahead.
I guess they circled it in 68
They
and then
circled
they
it in
landed
68,
in 69.
but
yeah,
circling and landing are two very different things.
My grandparents, by the way, were absolutely convinced that was a massive hoax.
Were they?
Worldwide.
So if they were here, they might be climate denialists.
They probably would
well.
be. There's probably no question about it. Yeah, so just a lifelong fascination with science, essentially, and a feeling that, I don't know, I guess what I feel about it is it's sort of the last human institution that works. Everything's failed. The government has failed, the church has failed. I know a lot of people don't feel that way, but it's easy to feel that way. And, here's something that, as best I can tell, still sort of works. And
the scientific community. So you've educated yourself to be able to evaluate these arguments.
I would say I'm still trying. This is a daily struggle. I mean, it's an incoming deluge. There are hundreds of scientific papers published every week on this topic. So imagine trying to keep.
How do you
with
choose which ones to read?
Reputation of the journals, all the ways you make. But lots and lots of things come in over the transom, and I have to sort of evaluate them. And they're clues. There's a really important scientific system called peer review that I know a lot of the audience knows about, but many people might not. In which you don't get in a serious scientific journal, you don't get in it without navigating a shooting gallery of other scientists, essentially, and their job is to pick a paper apart and try to find the holes. And so we rely on that system to help us make sense of what's real and what's not. In the end, I put not a lot of stock in a single paper. I'm looking for weight of evidence, balance of evidence. If there's a claim that something's a problem, I want 10 papers, 15, 20 papers on that before I'm even willing to say, many scientists think, much less willing to state it as fact.
I'm going to go to questions from the audience pretty soon, because I think we might have a number of them. And moving to that microphone eventually will be the way to do that. But I want to talk a little bit about, okay, how do we respond? You introduced at one point the idea that we have a democratic conversation. This is part of that going on right now. and then we decide what are the appropriate solutions. Give us a little window into where would that go in your mind? What are, sketch out what are some reasonable, appropriate, potentially effective actions. We'll start at the government level, then we'll go to the personal level.
Sure. I mean, a lot of people sort of ask that question. I speak on a lot of college campuses, and the students these days, I mean, many of you know, if you have sons and daughters that age, are pretty concerned about this, much more aware of it than you and I were in our day, probably.
Yep.
And people will say, you know, the problem is so large, and I feel so small, and what can I do? I guess. I don't know. Can we flip it around and take the personal first?
Sure.
And then the
You're the one answering. You can take it any way you want.
It is a hard question to answer, and I say to people, turning off the light when you leave the room is a good place to start. I mean, just personal awareness of the energy we use. That we all have a carbon footprint, that everything you touch, everything you eat, every time you get in your car, every time you get on an airplane, you are putting carbon into the air that alters the climate of this planet for tens of thousands of years in the future. Every time you throw a light switch, you're doing that.
Because the climate, once the carbon goes up, it doesn't come down?
Lots and lots of it stays up there for a long time.
Okay.
There's a long tail on...
Does planting more forests make a big difference?
We don't have a lot of room to do that, especially with the food situation.
Okay, good. Go ahead. I interrupted.
Yeah. So it matters for people to become sort of aware on a personal level of their own carbon footprint. We have lots of opportunities lying in front of us, as we were talking about the other night. Your house is probably leaking a little more air than it needs to, and there might be economic advantage to you in sort of caulking those windows.
He was sitting on my sofa under a blanket. It was I had the heater up, and he was freezing. So that's kind of a sign. Isn't it?
Window,
some kind of leakage.
There's a problem in there. In fact, there's a tremendous opportunity to essentially stop wasting what we already have. You know, I mean, we waste a lot still. The United States is by far, per capita, the largest carbon emitter in the world. I don't want to sort of guilt trip anybody out about that, but it's just very clear that we have room to cut. You know, I mean, France emits sort of half the carbon we do. Germany emits half as much as we do, and Paris and Berlin are not howling wastelands. The last time I was there,
Yeah,
so
but we beat them.
Right. The bigger answer to what people can do is that they can educate themselves about this problem. All gratitude to our audience for coming tonight, because we have to talk about it, and we have to sort of begin to understand it as a society and as citizens. There are good books to read. We can even name some if people want to do that. In the end, we will not solve this without national and international policy on a substantial scale. It is just not solvable. It's what we call a commons problem. There are tremendous sort of incentives to cheat. There are tremendous incentives to say, oh, let's let Australia reduce their emissions. Let's make China reduce theirs, and while we do nothing.
Well, but that's a real issue. I mean, and despite the New York Times' best efforts toward one world government, there really isn't one yet.
There really isn't.
There really is not one yet, and so
There's not going to be one anytime soon.
Not going to be one anytime soon. Right. So when we talk about there needs to be international efforts at the same time that literally billions of people are trying to get in on the carbon burning game rather than out of it, doesn't that sort of say game over even before we start?
It's tough. It's tough. We're in a. This is. I think if you look at the polling, the American public understands that this is a problem. Gallup has had a question running since 1989. It's a weirdly worded question. It's like, do you personally worry about climate change? I mean, I could say no to that, but that the number of people who say yes to that has sort of never fallen below. It's never fallen below half. It's always. I mean, right now it's, I believe, 58, 59% and climbing. What people don't understand is the urgency of the problem. That we are essentially out of time. We needed to begin making emissions reductions 20 years ago in the West, at least. We did not. You now have, as you say, the rising billions who want to get in on carbon burning. To some extent, emissions are falling here now, as you know. They're falling in Europe. That's a little bit of a facade. This thing in my pocket here was made in China, and there are a lot of emissions associated with manufacturing this iPhone. Those emissions are counted against China, yet here I am walking around with it in my pocket.
Right.
So what we're really seeing is a sort of global shift in where things are made. That's not because of carbon or carbon policy, but it's making carbon policy more difficult. We're at a point where it's just not going to be enough for the West to say, okay, we're willing to go first. We'll let you Chinese burn some more. We'll let you Indians burn some more. We are so up against it in terms of the total global carbon budget. We can actually talk about that concept if you want, that everybody's going to have to be figuring out how to make reductions or how to top out. And that brings up a tremendous question of global equity. The Chinese are looking at us and saying, wait a minute, you turkeys have been doing this, burning this stuff for 200 years. You've got nice lives over there. You've got, you're still the world's per capita emitters by far. You're 2.5 times above us still per capita. And you want us to stop, So we've got to find our way out of to a deal where everybody feels like they're getting treated fairly, or there is no deal. And that's been very hard to do. We've been trying to do that for essentially 20 years now, and we have not licked it.
Well, let's say that the United States should do something itself. Okay, we're talking over here in this endless conversation. You're king for a day. What would you do? Cap and trade, a carbon tax, $1 trillion investment in capture and storage? What would be your number one thing you'd like to see the government do?
Well, I don't, again, I'm apolitical as much as I can be. I don't want to take the position of what I would like to see the government do.
What do you think would be most effective based on your research?
What are the options? What are the options, basically? I guess my short answer is sort of all of the above.
You don't get all of the above.
Well,
all three of those lifts are incredibly hard.
Are incredibly big, yeah. It is not obvious what to do, I think. And in fact, it's not entirely clear to me that we can get out of this box. It's not entirely clear that it's doable. We may be fated here to sort of go over whatever cliff is waiting for us, however tall it is. I'm actually trying to launch a series right now that asks the question, can we get out of this box? And I've got a piece getting fairly close to ready that tackles this question of carbon markets. We've had a spread of carbon markets around the world. Right now, it's the sort of marquee policy for any government that wants to show it's doing something and getting serious. And so we've had them adopt. Europe's been running one for about 8 years now, in which they it's a cap and trade system in which they put a price on carbon. And I guess if the audience wants to, we can go further into kind of what that is and how it works. It's not clear to me that carbon markets are working.
Well, the criticism of the European carbon market is that they set the total so high that nobody's suffering any pain.
That's right. Or essentially they've had a crash in the price because they gave away, because they were unambitious in the way they set up the rules. Right now, California, and this has only been in operation since the beginning of the year, but California seems to have the most effective carbon market in the world. They seem to have gotten this right in terms of the way you design the rules. Some kind of a price on carbon is a major option. The economists will sort of say, we kind of think it's all you need. That's the, the sort of purist economic view. And that's based on, if we try to do too much, if we spend too much on this problem, we are impoverishing present generations to the benefit of future generations. If we spend too little, we're impoverishing the future to our own benefit. So we got to get the price right.
By the way, I'm in favor of the second more than the first.
So we got to get
just kidding.
We got to get the price right, but people can't agree on what the right price is.
Right.
So what we've really been doing is kind of trying to pick a price that's sort of politically palatable and crossing our fingers and hoping it's right. Setting a price is a major option. You can do that through a carbon market. You can do it through a tax. I think there's some people here from something called the Citizens Climate Lobby, which Jim Hansen supports, the famous climate scientist, and they don't want a carbon market. They want a tax that's then given back to the public.
Right.
So in other words, you'd pay extra for your gasoline, but then you get the money back. And if you're smart enough not to spend it on more gasoline or something, then you benefit versus somebody else.
Right.
I think we're moving toward a consensus that a price alone is probably not enough, and we need some other things. Seems pretty clear that we need a major push on technology and development and early stage technological development. A lot of people, I think, sort of imagine that we're spending a tremendous amount of money on that right now, and that of all things, surely we're doing a lot of research to try to solve this problem. In fact, we are nowhere near, when you adjust for inflation, we are nowhere near what we were spending on energy research in the late 70s and early 80s. It just fell off a cliff in the Reagan era, and it has never come back up. So,
you're out here in energy country. I mean, the number one thing that's happened in the past 10 years to address this problem is the
natural gas.
Perfection of hydraulic fracturing for natural gas. How can environmentalists be opposed to that when it is the best current non-government answer we have to our emissions problem?
So one of the clues that I think this issue is, this set of issues, this whole set of problems is becoming real and becoming a true democratic question, is that there is no longer any sort of environmentalist position on anything. We have people who call themselves environmentalists who are at bloody war with each other over what you might call sort of local environmental concerns versus national or global concerns. We have lots of people trying to stop solar energy projects out in the California desert because they're bad for desert tortoises and various other desert life. A serious issue, by the way. I mean, there are tremendously rich ecosystems in the desert that are in fact endangered if you go pave the desert with solar panels. And so we're at a point, and I think what this is really telling us is we're beyond easy choices here. I mean, we're at a point where we've got to make hard choices, and just because you sort of wave a green flag and call yourself an environmentalist doesn't get you exempted from making hard choices.
I'm going to ask one more, and then we're going to go to audience questions at this microphone if anybody wants to start going over there. You raised this rather depressing prospect that we may already have, we're on the Niagara River, and we've passed the point at which our little engine can get us back upstream. We're going over the falls. Does your examination of the science suggest where that number is? I mean, if we were able to stop at 700 parts per million rather than 1,000, or is that just terra incognita? We have no idea.
There is a formal, people have an idea. I mean, within some, pretty fat error margins. There's a formal international goal let's back up and talk a little bit about the numbers, because to approach this problem, you need some sense of the numbers. In fact, if you look on your chart there, you'll notice. Just look at the chart, the two charts that show you the sort of warming in the past on the map. and then the projected warming in the future. Notice those are two different scales. You got to kind of make the mental adjustment that you're looking at two different scales. It's also in degrees centigrade, so you got to multiply times 1.8. But the distinctive feature I want you to notice on those maps is look at how much more it's warming over land than over the oceans. So we've got the oceans out there acting as this kind of big heat sink. We have had already about 1.5 degrees of global warming since the pre-industrial era. So all the impacts that we're seeing, land ice melting all over the planet, Greenland beginning to melt, West Antarctica beginning to destabilize, sea level rising at an accelerating pace, all of that has happened from 1.5 degrees of warming. What we're talking about is we have a formal international goal of stopping the warming at or below 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Celsius of warming. To do that, we need to stop, we probably need to stop at about 450 ppm, or another way to say it is we need to stop at about 1 trillion tons of carbon emitted into the atmosphere. We are more than halfway there. We're at about 550 right now. And at the current burn rate, at the current sort of acceleration rate, we will be there in 30 to 40 years. In other words, we're heading toward a mere few decades from now. You know, within the lifetime of certainly of some of the younger people in this room, we need to have the technology to be able to stop cold turkey if we're going to stay below that target.
So we've got to slow it now and be moving aggressively to
zero.
To zero.
Most smart people don't think it can be done at this point, that we're going over the target. We're going over the 3.6 into what people think is pretty dangerous global warming. How much over is, it's in your hands. I mean, it's a
We've
democratic
got
question.
a bunch of questions. Sir.
I'm surprised that I didn't hear anything from you about the effects of climate change on precipitation, rainfall, or snowfall. When I've read and listened to other to climate scientists, that's the thing that they're focusing on having the biggest impact on human water supplies, on food supply, and on ecosystems other than along the coast and in the Arctic, of course. And the other aspect about the effect on rainfall and snowfall, from what I can gather, is that scientists' ability to predict that compared to their ability to predict temperature changes is far inferior to predicting temperature changes. Would you comment on that?
You are precisely right in every respect, and I apologize if I omitted it. I mean, this is just so vast. I mean, it's the Zambezi River of subjects, and you know, we could easily be here, 5 or 6 hours talking just about rainfall. I mean, climate change is to a substantial extent a water problem. Too much ocean, coming at us. Changes in rainfall patterns. It's a complicated set of predictions, though, when it comes to precipitation. In total, we think that precipitation is going to go up, and that's because in a warmer climate, you will get more evaporation from the ocean. That extra moisture then has to fall out as rain, a lot of it over the continents. We are beginning to see this already. There's pretty good evidence that the total humidity in the atmosphere is going up over time by about the amount you would expect from the climate models. I think people are not at all confident in their ability to predict the changes at a local scale, and I would say that goes beyond precipitation, for that matter. I mean, we think we can predict the averages because there's only sort of so much energy in the Earth system, and when you add more, it's got to sort of balance out. But how that plays out at a local scale is really quite uncertain. We are likely to have, we're already seeing a trend of more rainfall in the east of the United States, so it's getting wetter in the east. It's getting drier in the west. This is a kind of a generalized prediction that the scientists make, that the hydrologic cycle will intensify, and The way they boil it down is wet places will get wetter, dry places will get drier. Some of that, it's complicated though. In between rains, it's going to be a hotter climate. Therefore, faster evaporation, soil moisture drying out faster. I mean, if you're a farmer, you're going to be careering between too little and too much. We kind of already are, right? I mean, here in the Midwest, you've gone from one of the worst corn crops in recent American history last year to the very best this year. And as far as I know, next year may be terrible again. We're in this era of sort of contending extremes almost. Our resiliency and ability to manage all that is going to be challenged. I mean, we probably need more water storage so that we can even out the dry years. That's having to build more dams is terrible in a lot of ways.
Yeah, but a place like the South, see, people are having trouble saying 2 or 3 degrees temperature getting warmer.
Yeah.
What does that mean to me? Mm-hmm. Why is that a big deal?
Okay, so it's
or
right.
6 inches on the coast. Why is that a big deal?
Yeah,
but
yeah.
if you're in the desert Southwest and your precipitation is going to go down by 1/3, which some of the models are saying, and you're already living in a desert that's having to do with what, 8 or 10 inches of rain a year? I mean, this is a big deal.
It is a big deal. Yeah. I mean, look at the map again. When we talk about 5 or 6 degrees total of global warming, which is what we're hoping to keep it to, that's our goal, is to stay below that. We're probably going to fail. That's more like 8 or 10 degrees over land. It's more like 15, even 20 degrees in the Arctic. Average. This is average, folks.
And one of the things that we haven't had a chance to talk to, that we spoke about at lunch, is that also changes not just the flora or the temperature in your house, it changes the insects that we're seeing, infestations of bugs that used to be killed in the hard winter frosts that now are decimating our pine forests. I'm intrigued to hear you essentially say that it's not the heat, it's the humidity. Yes, sir.
I just want to tell you something that sounds like science fiction. About 9 months ago in the Air University Review, there was a study which talked about putting a 400 square mile solar panel system up into the atmosphere, which could produce half the electrical requirement of the world. Now, it sounds like science fiction. I could give you all the detail. The Japanese last month appropriated $9 billion to put up a test model by the year 2030. The Chinese are working on the same kind of thing. Nobody in the United States can get beyond fracking.
Right. I think it's a question of the extension cord, isn't it? I know, I'm teasing.
It's a really interesting question. We can sit here and sort of make our best predictions about what's going to happen to the Earth system and the physical thing, and we can project forward as well as we can on technology. We don't really know what technology development is going to look like, for the next 20 years, much less the next 1,000, right? And I mean, at this point, almost the only policy we have is hoping for a technological miracle. And, technological miracles have come along before.
They have come along.
They have come along.
We could hope for another one. Yes,
Right.
sir.
Yes, I was just wondering, and this is more of an opinionated question in your professional opinion. If we had done the things that Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter talked about in the 1970s, will we even be sitting here having this conversation today?